In this clip, I'll be going over my understanding of the first part of Spinoza, a Handbook to the Ethics, by James Allanson Picton, specifically the section titled Concerning God. Picton begins by noting that readers often find Spinoza difficult, not because the ideas themselves are unknowable, but because we bring habits of thought to the reading that are deeply out of step with his. If we're expecting traditional theological language or a personal God, we'll misread Spinoza entirely. In his earlier writings, Spinoza occasionally used conventional religious terms: prophecy, signs, inspiration, but only as a concession to the language of his time. In the Ethics, however, he writes not for his peers, but for posterity, and in doing so, he withholds every attempt to simplify his version for public comfort. He offers instead a pure and solitary meditation on being itself. Spinoza chose to cast the Ethics in the style of Euclid's geometry. For many, this appears strange, even alien, but Picton defends the choice. In the 17th century, this structure was not yet seen as an impossible model. The idea that the universe might be comprehended in such terms had not yet been discarded. And Spinoza was determined to state clearly, precisely, and without compromise, what he believed to be true. Even so, Picton reminds us, this structure can obscure more than it reveals. The core message remains accessible only to those willing to break through the surface and recognize that Spinoza's goal was not just to explain the universe, but to reconcile us to it, to reveal the deep unity that connects our finite minds with infinite reality. Spinoza's God is not a being outside the universe, acting on it from without. Spinoza's God is the universe, the eternal, necessary substance in which all things live, move, and have their being. The early part of the Ethics introduces a phrase that became central to his philosophy. God, or substance, involving infinite attributes, of which each one expresses eternal and infinite essence, of necessity exists. Here we're told that the universe, God, is not made up of things created by something else. It is the reality in which all other things take shape, and every finite thing we experience, ourselves included, is an expression of this infinite substance. Picton's insights here is subtle but important. He explains that Spinoza's aim is not to prove God's existence in the traditional sense, but to show that the fact of our existence points necessarily to a prior infinite being, not as a person, but as the eternal ground of all being. What we are, he writes, must exist in and by something that already is. And what already is must be without beginning, without cause, an infinite whole, not a finite part. The God of Spinoza is not separate from the world. It is not a divine person enthroned somewhere in space, but the universe itself, existing necessarily and eternally. To many, this sounds abstract, but Picton urges us to see it as deeply grounded. For isn't it more consistent with reason to say that no limited thing could exist independently? That all things must be rooted in something infinite? Whether we're speaking of a galaxy, a single tree, or even a thought, all are part of an unbroken chain flowing from eternal reality. This leads us to the definition of substance, a key term in Spinoza's thought. He defines it as that which is in and by itself and is conceived through itself. It doesn't rely on anything else to exist or to be understood. And for Spinoza, there's only one such substance: God, or nature, or the universe. Everything else, colors, thoughts, trees, time, is a mode of that one infinite reality. Picton pauses to clarify difficulty. If Spinoza defines substance as that which is in and by itself and is conceived through itself, then neither generalized matter nor generalized mind, what we typically call reality and consciousness, fit. Matter always needs mind to be understood, and consciousness depends on impressions from the world. So neither can truly be said to exist in and by itself. What then is Spinoza's substance? It is something deeper, more primary than either. It's that final unity that underlies all we see and all we think. Picton relates this to what another philosopher, Herbert Spencer, called ultimate actuality. But where Spencer viewed this actuality as something unknowable, Spinoza was certain it would be adequately conceived, at least in part. Here, Picton draws a crucial distinction. While Spencer left us with an unknowable force behind appearances, Spinoza insists that we can know substance as that which requires no other idea to define it. He compares Spinoza's clarity to Euclid's definitions of a point or a line. Not things we encounter in the physical world, but concepts that remain stable and self-evident within the world of ideas. So when Spinoza says that substance is in and by itself, he means that it is the only thing that explains itself. It is not shaped by anything else, and includes within it everything we might otherwise try to explain it with. And it is everywhere and nowhere, not confined to a place, because it is the whole itself. This idea leads us to Spinoza's treatment of the divine attributes. For him, God, or substance, is endowed with infinite attributes, though only two are available to the human mind: extension and thought. Extension is the attribute of God that makes all spatial reality intelligible. In other words, everything we can measure, see, and observe is a mode, a modification of God's attribute of extension. But since this attribute is infinite, what we perceive are only finite modes, measurable things, tangible things, modes that come and go, though extension itself remains. Picton illustrates this through a metaphor. Just as a surveyor can always verify a map through triangulation, no matter how the terrain has changed, so too we can verify the reality of extension through careful observation. Rivers may dry up, volcanoes may erupt, but the space those events occur in remains extension, unchanging, infinite, and real. Yet, extension is only knowable to us through its finite modes. Space, motion, objects, even qualities like weight or pressure, all are how extension becomes accessible to us. Even what we call the material world is, for Spinoza, not a separate domain, but a subset of extension. In fact, Spinoza says that everything we can perceive, our bodies, the natural world, even the stars, are all modes of the divine attribute of extension. They are constantly changing in form, but as expressions of the one eternal attribute, they are grounded in a single infinite reality. But extension is only half the picture. The other attribute Spinoza believes we can perceive is thought. Just like extension gives us access to the world of space, thought gives us access to the world of awareness. Picton clarifies that Spinoza doesn't mean discursive reasoning or inner dialogue. Instead, he follows Descartes in defining thought more broadly as awareness itself. Everything that takes place in our conscious minds, perceptions, emotions, ideas, impressions, wherever there is awareness of a tree, of a memory, of a sorrow, there is thought, and so there is God. Thus, in Spinoza's system, God knows himself through the attribute of thought, just as he is manifest in space through the attribute of extension. Only two attributes are known to us, but Spinoza insists there are infinitely more. Each one expresses a different aspect of God's infinite nature. We merely perceive what our minds are built to comprehend. Spinoza says that even though God's attributes are infinite, we only perceive them through finite expressions, or what he calls modes. So when we experience a tree, a storm, or a sunset, we're not seeing God in full. We're catching a glimpse, a mode, of God's attribute of extension. Likewise, every emotion, memory, or spark of imagination is a finite mode of the attribute of thought. And here's what that means. Every part of the world we can see, hear, taste, touch, or think about, every single thing, is God showing up in a way we can handle. Infinity doesn't mean endless sameness. It means endless variety. So, Spinoza says, God's infinite attributes give rise to an infinite variety of finite modes, a cosmic dance of causes and effects. This is the divine life. Everything is in motion. Everything is part of the whole, and everything is connected. Eternity is not just endless time. It's not forever, as we usually imagine it. For Spinoza, eternity is more like an infinite now, the timeless being of God, in which everything happens, not in sequence, but in unity. So when we look around and see change, seasons shifting, people aging, planets turning, we're seeing things from our limited point of view. But from the perspective of eternity, everything's held together in one single act of being. This also means that God doesn't grow, change, or react. God is all at once, fully, eternally. Thought and extension are the only two we, as humans, can grasp. But Spinoza says there are infinitely many, and each one expresses something about God's eternal essence. But don't think of these attributes like pieces of a puzzle or parts of a machine. They're more like different angles on the same reality, different ways the infinite shows up. Spinoza's metaphor says that attributes are like different faces of a diamond. You can't separate them from the diamond itself. You're just seeing different sides of the same truth. Let's say you measure the height of a mountain. The mountain may change, erode, rise, or quake, but the space it occupies, the extension, remains. That's what Spinoza is getting at. Reality is always changing in its modes, but the attribute beneath them is steady, infinite, divine. Extension isn't just space. It includes everything in motion, waves crashing, wind blowing, even the pressure you feel in your chest when you're anxious. That's motion. And motion is a mode of extension. So is thought. And for Spinoza, that includes every perception, idea, or awareness. Not just reasoning or logic, but the whole swirl of consciousness. Even your simple awareness of being here, right now, listening to this, is a mode of the infinite attribute of thought. That's why Spinoza says, we're not separate from God. We are modes of God. We don't just live in the universe lives in us. You are an expression of the infinite. Your thoughts, your body, your experiences, they're all ways the universe knows itself. Spinoza's message isn't just philosophical, it's grounding. It tells us we're not floating in a meaningless void. We're ripples in a boundless ocean of being. And when we slow down enough to feel that connection, even for a moment, that's when we remember we are the universe, becoming aware of itself. Spinoza says, eternity has nothing to do with time. It's not just time stretched out forever. It's not a clock ticking into infinity. Eternity for Spinoza is a kind of timeless presence, a pure now that doesn't move from past to future. It's how God exists, always, fully, without change. God doesn't become more or less over time. God doesn't grow or evolve. Spinoza puts it plainly. God is now all that can be. Nothing can be added. Nothing is missing. So while we experience life as change, birth, growth, decay, from Spinoza's view, everything already exists, held together in the eternal unity of God's being. Now remember, Spinoza says God has infinite attributes, not just the two we can know. We're aware of thought, and extension because they're accessible to human consciousness. But there are countless others beyond our grasp, like dimensions we can't see, or music we can't hear. One philosopher, Sir Frederick Pollock, raised an interesting challenge. If we only know things through thought, doesn't that make all other attributes just forms of thought? But Spinoza pushes back. He says no. These attributes aren't illusions or metaphors. They're real, even if they're beyond our comprehension. Just like a dog can't understand calculus, we're not equipped to grasp the fullness of God's nature. So, how do we live in a universe that's infinite when we ourselves are finite? Spinoza gives us a powerful image. Imagine a mountain, vast and towering. Now picture 4 people standing on different sides of it. One sees a waterfall, another a jagged cliff, a third sees snowfields, and the last a peaceful forest. Each of them is telling the truth, but none of them sees the whole mountain. That's how it is for us. Our minds are like one perspective on the mountain of reality. What we see is true, but it's relatively true. It's not the full picture, just a part. And this doesn't just apply to the world out there, it applies to us, too. Even our sense of self, your I, is a finite mode of thought. It's real, but it's not the whole story. So when you see a tree, or hear music, or feel love, or even feel lonely, those are not just private, separate experiences. They're God expressing itself through your unique window. They're the infinite made finite, just enough for you to take in. Spinoza says all the distinct things we see, objects, people, even ourselves, are abstractions from the infinite. Not false, but partial. Our experience is always a slice of the whole, never the whole itself. And that brings us to something Spinoza quietly teaches throughout his work: humility. The world doesn't revolve around our limited perspective. And that's not a loss, it's a gift. Because once we accept that we're not separate from the whole, we can stop striving to control it or defend ourselves from it. Instead, we can begin to feel something deeper. We are already part of it, always have been, always will be. We're not drops in the ocean. We are the ocean, thinking it's a drop. Spinoza's universe is built on interconnection. No thing exists by itself. Nothing stands alone. He says that every individual thing, whether a tree, a thought, or your morning coffee, exists because something else caused it to be. And that thing was caused by another and another, stretching back endlessly. Imagine it like this. You're standing in a river. The water flowing past you didn't start here. It's coming from upstream. But upstream has its own source, and so on. That's how Spinoza sees reality, an infinite flow of causes and effects, all held within God. And he puts it plainly: no finite thing can exist or act unless it is determined by another finite thing. In other words, everything that is because of something else. Everything that happens because of something else. Nothing in this world stands on its own. Not even you. It's easy to think of this as cold or mechanical, but Spinoza didn't mean it that way. In fact, he believed this idea of interconnectedness was beautiful, something poets had always been pointing to, that ancient image of the world where the sun rises and sets, and rivers flow to the sea, and generations come and go, all part of the same eternal rhythm. What we call the universe, Spinoza calls God. Not a being with emotions and choices, but the infinite, eternal substance from which everything flows. And he introduces nature active and nature passive. Nature active is the creative, expressive side of God, the power by which everything flows and unfolds. Nature passive is everything that comes into being, the actual things that exist within that unfolding. These aren't two separate realities. They're two perspectives on the same divine movement. The current and the wave, the breath and the body. And then comes the question of freedom. Spinoza's idea of freedom is probably not what you're used to. He says freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's not about breaking rules or defying nature. True freedom, for Spinoza, is when you act in harmony with the truth of how things are, when you understand the necessity and interconnection of all things and live in alignment with that. God is free, not because God chooses from a menu of options, but because everything God does flows directly and necessarily from God's own nature. When you understand how you fit into the whole, when you see yourself as a mode of the infinite, you begin to act not from fear or desire, but from understanding. And that, Spinoza says, is where real freedom begins. And this brings us to the end of part 1 of Spinoza, a handbook to the ethics